why you wanted to make this film.
Sure. The film is called American. It stars this young man right here to my left. It's a story about a veteran Japanese-American who works at a museum in Los Angeles, the Japanese-American National Museum. And he encounters a young lady who comes into the museum and shows a photograph of her grandfather. And this veteran is immediately kind of transported back to the time when he was himself interned at a Japanese-American internment camp and later fought for the 442 in World War II. And it's an important film that I think so many Americans just are not aware of this chapter in our history, and it was a darker chapter in our history that people should know about. That was the thing that grabbed me, and our executive producer, his wife is Japanese American. So when I first met him, he said, "Richie, one day I'd like to tell a story that highlights that part of my wife's family's experience." And that was probably the seed that was planted with me. And one night, in the middle of the night when I couldn't sleep, I had an idea of an aged veteran that works in a museum, kind of like the way that I described, and that was the genesis of the story.
How did you get connected with George?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. So, speaking to the fact that our executive producer, without someone with the means to support the telling of the story, it's tough to make films. And I told him, I think it was literally the next morning, I called him up and I said, I had an idea for a film, but we could do it as a short film. And he said, okay, what's the story? And I told him about it, and I said, would you have an interest in supporting that? And he said, well, why don't you write it? I said, okay, and literally right then I just started jamming, and I made kind of a Frankenstein Microsoft Word version of a script that was really first started as just scenes that, veteran walks in a museum, this sort of thing happens, and before I knew it, I was pumping out dialogue. And so I sent him that, and he said, okay, I like it. And I said, I want to go to George Takei with this. And he said, I told you my family's connection with George, right? And I'm like, no, that's amazing. So he said, my wife's mother grew up working for George's father in the internment camp where George was interned. The world cannot be a smaller place than that. And so at that point, I said, okay, well, look, let me reformat this thing into final draft and make it a script, like something George is used to taking a look at. And in the meantime, one of their dear friends, Marilyn Takuda, who George knows, an actress in Los Angeles, said, I can get, if you send us an email, I can get that in front of George. And that's what we did. I sent him the script, and maybe George can respond as to once he got the script. But it was relatively easy, because first to write a story like that, and to have the idea to go to an actor, of George's repute is, especially to do a short film. If it was to do a feature, I'm sure George, with his respect for this subject matter, would have absolutely taken a look at it. But a short film, that's asking a lot of someone who's acted as long as George has on such meaningful projects. So thank you, George. That's a weird way of saying thanks for doing this.
Well, it's been my mission in life. I grew up behind those barbed wire fences. As a 5-year-old, I was categorized as an enemy alien. All Japanese Americans on the West Coast were categorized as enemy alien. My mother was born in Sacramento, California. My father was a San Franciscan. We're Americans, and yet war hysteria spread throughout the country. And I had taken it on for myself as my life mission to raise the awareness of this dark chapter of American history, particularly because today, especially now, it's so timely. The story is so relevant. Whether it's the very first executive order passed by our current man that's called the president. He signed the first Muslim travel ban in February 2017. There was such an uproar over that. I mean, Americans had learned a lesson of the incarceration of Japanese Americans, because when that first executive order was signed, thousands of Americans all throughout the country rushed to their respective airports to protest the Muslim travel ban. Lawyers went to the airports to offer pro bono service, and the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, Sally Yates, refused to defend that. And so he tried a second time, and that didn't fly either, and a third time, finally, the Supreme Court gave it its approval. So there's this relevance to our times today, but during my adult life, it's been my mission to inform fellow Americans of that chapter. And so when Richie approached me with this project, I immediately took it on, because the offer, the payment wasn't much, but the script was substantial. It was short, but it took place inside a museum that we founded. I'm one of the founders of the Japanese American National Museum. And we tell the story intellectually and historically, but we also wanted to tell the story so that it hits people's hearts, to humanize that story. And San Diego played an important part in that. We developed a musical called Allegiance that talks about the incarceration of Japanese Americans and how that incarceration fractured the Japanese American community and Japanese American families in many cases as well. And we had the first premiere performance of Allegiance here in San Diego at the very respected regional theater, the Old Globe Theater in Balboa Park. And so San Diego has a near and dear part of my heart because of that connection to our mission. And when we did Allegiance on Broadway, some Japanese Americans traveled across the country to see it in New York. And one evening, a Japanese American woman brought her 92-year-old mother backstage to introduce her to me. And she introduced her mother as someone who, as a teenager, worked for my father, who was a block manager in the Arkansas camp, a camp called Roar. And I remember, not so much Florence, that's the name of the lady, but I remembered this lady that had a machine in that office, and she was tapping away. And as a 5-year-old kid, I was absolutely fascinated by how she made that sound, went twang, and then kept it up. And when she zipped the paper out, it was a report that she was typing out. Very formal looking print. And I remember as a 5-year-old kid being absolutely impressed by that. Well, that same young girl was now this 92-year-old lady that I was being introduced to backstage at the Longacre Theater. And she is the lady that he just mentioned, my father's secretary at the Roar camp. And so we have a very convoluted connection to the story, both in terms of the story itself, but also a personal connection.
leads me to my question for you, George. This is a very personal role for you. What were some of the emotions and feelings you were having when you were playing this character? Because it's important to you and to your heart.
Well, I'm playing a 95-year-old man. So I had to reach as an actor. He made me look old enough. But I know those people, the veterans that volunteer at the museum. I used to be the chairman of the board of the museum, and I'm still on the board of trustees. And I've spoken with and gotten to know, be friends with those volunteers. So I know those people, and I think of the names. I think of Manabi or Tad, all these people who are now gone, but they took their mission as volunteers to tell that story very seriously. And I probably used to tell people that the Japanese American National Museum is the only museum in the United States where our docents can talk about the exhibits personally. They can tell you, I was there, I felt this, and I did that. Where so many other museums will give you very knowledgeable, erudite histories that happened in 1876 or whatever. But our museum had people that could tell the stories personally, and that made that museum experience that much more profound and human, I think. We don't have those volunteers anymore. There are more than a few that are still with us, but they're in their 90s, and it's difficult for them to do volunteer work. But we went to a fundraising dinner for the group that tells the story of the 442nd, and we began that dinner with the stage curtain opening up, and there were 24 veterans on stage, all very elderly, some in wheelchairs, some when they got up, walked with a cane, but there they were, proud and sharing their presence with us at that fundraising dinner. So this project is something that is very near and dear to my heart, as all the other projects that I've done have been. And he's a wonderful director. He's a passionate director. I could feel his passion in telling that story. It's not personal like me, and yet he made it personal for himself. And so it was a pleasure, as hectic and as exhausting and as brief as that was. It was last year, but we shot at the museum that we founded. And a half block from our museum is a huge black granite monument that bears all the names of the members of the 442nd who served. Young men who went from barbed wire imprisonment in their own country to fight for the country that was still imprisoning their family. It's an amazing story, incredible story. People who bit the bullet and swallowed the bitter taste and put on the same uniform as that of the sentries in the guard towers, with their guns pointed at us and their families. They went out of those barbed wire camps to fight for this country, to prove their Americanism. It's an unbelievable story, and now we are telling that story to all of America, with a museum, with Broadway musicals, and with film.
That's wonderful, George. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Richie, maybe you could tell us a little bit about, George just mentioned, you may not have as strong of a personal connection as he does, but why you chose to tell this story, and maybe if you do have any military connections or anything that inspired you.
Sure. I absolutely do have military connections. My father and two of his brothers went to West Point, Vietnam veterans. Two of those three brothers both of my grandfathers fought in World War II, and you know, whenever when I had the idea for this story, and I did research and learned about this rarely talked about, you know, period in American history. You know, I reached out to my father and I said, who's also a fellow writer. Dad writes novels, so his name is Richard Barlow Adams. I'll give him a little plug, but he writes historical fiction, and one of those books was West Point on the Eve of the Civil War. But so huge military influence in my family. But I reached out to Dad and said, I want to tell a story that, you know, speaks to the internment of Japanese Americans, and maybe one of those young men who was interned works at the museum, which at the time I had no idea that such a museum existed, the Japanese American National Museum. I mean, it was just, I figured maybe there was a museum somewhere that would have some information, but I was not aware of JANM. But when I explained to him, he said, well, son, you might want to incorporate a military, you know, component to the story. I'm like, Dad, everything is always military with you, but I love that about him. But he said, no, he said, there is a highly decorated, in fact, one of the most decorated units in the history of American warfare is the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And as fate would have it, Dad and Mom were on a cruise heading to Hawaii, like literally the week after I told him I wanted to do this. And he arranged a meeting with some 442 members that were in their 90s. And one of those men was a man by the name of Clinton Shiriashi. And that was the inspiration for the character Clinton in the film. And people have asked, is it a true story? It's not a true story, but it's a true story that's grounded in fact all over, you know. But that was my father is responsible for pulling in the 442 component, and that's why this was so important, you know, to me, and I know to George, to learn of the GI Film Festival. And then whenever I got the phone call from the lovely ladies at the festival that we had been accepted, you know, I felt really, really proud, you know, on behalf of my grandfathers and my father, and yeah. One second. But anyway, we have a real life 442 gentleman that's coming tonight. His name is Don Secchi, and Don is when we were making the film, we ran into, first of all, I've made a number of feature films, and filming in Los Angeles, as you all know, you're pretty close to LA, if you need to find props, you can find props anywhere you look. You know, you've got mega props, you've got all the big prop houses. Well, the one prop that is written into the film is the Garrison Cap that George would wear, which is the old cap that is specific to the 442. I didn't realize this, but they wear a red, white, and blue cap. And each of the different regiments would have a different cap that kind of honors their group. So the prop, we're only about 2 days out from filming it, and the production designer comes up and says, Richie, I can't find that cap. And I'm like, you checked all the prop houses? And she's like, yeah. She's like, I can't find it, but I can make one. I was like, no, we can't make, and I had no doubt she would knock it out of the park, but I'm like, we can't make that. We need a legit original cap. So I reached out to Mitch Mackey, who is the head of the Go for Broke National Education Center, which was the group that George was talking about, raising funds for the telling of that important story. And Mitch put the word out to the greater community, and I mean, within, I'd say 20 minutes, I got a phone call that young lady, Tracy Secchi, would be willing for me to use her father's cap if I would come down and meet him at the VA home in right on Wilshire, you know, in the 405. I said, absolutely, I'll be there in 20 minutes. I was downtown I think locations county Janet at the time, but I got to meet him, and you guys, if you're there tonight, will get to meet him. He is coming. He's 95, I believe. I don't think he's 96 yet. And he lost his arm in 3 days after the rescue of the Lost Battalion, which is a battle where there was a Texas battalion that was surrounded in the Vosges Mountains in France, and they had sent in American troops to rescue these guys, but no one could get them out. And they said, well, let's send in the 442. And the 442 had a reputation for being, for just winning the battles that they would go into. And their mantra was go for broke, just go for it. And they were ultimately, you'll see it if you see the film, but we did kind of an homage to that battle, that rescue in the film. And I can't tell you how powerful it was for the young men, played by Leonardo Nam, who's on Westworld, and Ivan Shaw, who did, Leonardo plays George's character as a young man. And to have someone on site when we were filming that battle, to be able to go ask him questions about what would have happened, was incredibly powerful for those young men. And I didn't know it at the time, but I said, did you fight the rescue of the Lost Battalion? And he said, yes. And he said, in fact, 3 days after that battle, he lost his arm and was ultimately sent home for his service after that.
We have about 2 more minutes in this session, and then we're going to do a breakout.
Great.
Is there anything else you want to add at this point? Or does anybody else have another question? We're going to have a little bit of one-on-one time.
There was so much passion in your and so much heart. How do you negotiate the overabundance of passion and heart in this story into such a short amount of space? What is the one thing that you kept as your objective in this in the telling of the story? Question for either both of you.
Well, I'll say a short, sweet one there. We wanted to make I think George spoke to this, making sure that the story had heart. This was not meant to be a strictly educational film, but a film that would give you an idea of what had happened, but also take you on an emotional ride of what someone who had endured that might have gone through, and re-experiencing when as someone who's in their 90s. I would speak to my grandfather, who I just lost last year, and if I asked him, what was it like in World War II? He's like, it was okay. Like they were incredibly powerful people, and that generation is just they wouldn't talk so much about it. And so what was an interesting thing, which George did an incredible job in the film, is the way he delivers, his spiel in the museum. It is almost like a spiel. He's been doing this for 20 years in the museum. He can crank it up and tell you exactly, what it would have been like. But when this one person shows him a photo that triggers back to that time, it's like something gets unlocked in him. And that was the idea, is if we could tap into that and have a viewer walk away with that type of emotional experience, then that would be good. But yeah, short films are really, really tough to take someone on an emotional ride, because you don't have a lot of time for setup. Okay, I lied, that wasn't short. But we can elaborate more. The last thing I'll say is, yes, George played a 95-year-old. George, the thing constant, the only real direction I had to give George was, okay, slow it down. Remember, you're 95. And then he would walk back in much slower, and I'm like, perfect. And that was literally the only thing I had to tell him.
Where can the American be seen next?
We will play next at the Heartland Film Festival in Indianapolis. And that's a wonderful festival, one of, I think, America's best festivals, and we'll play alongside a documentary called Proof of Loyalty, which is another film that explores this subject matter. But yeah, that's October 20th. And then beyond that, we're exploring putting the film out on VOD platforms, possibly Amazon, Netflix,